Hello and welcome, everybody. This is part 3 of Donald Barr's Space Relations. John Craig, on his way home from the Betelgeuse conference with the praises of his superiors, "Solid work, John. Neat, but not gaudy," still running through his mind, dawdled in the tiny, ingenious shower that belonged to his stateroom. The shower itself, sending scratchy little jets of hot water over his plump body, was satisfying. The fact of the shower was more so. It was a sign of the impressive eminence to which he had already risen. The Star Queen was a luxury liner, but only 4 staterooms had their own showers. And he was only 31. Rubbing a cake of soap sensuously over his chest, he amused himself by counting the names of men who stood between himself and the secretaryship and trying to guess their retirement dates. He was more than a little amused at his own complacency. The water and the dream engulfed him, and for several moments he did not hear the howl of the alarm. When the klaxon made its way into his consciousness, he did not know what it meant, but he dried himself hastily and began to dress. "All passengers, all hands!" An authoritative voice honked from the little speaker over the bunk. "All passengers, all hands! This is the captain! This is the captain! In 30 seconds we will break out of infraspace. In 30 seconds we will break out of infraspace. Lie down at once in the nearest bunk or webbing station. Lie down at once in the nearest bunk or webbing station. Strap yourself in. Strap yourself in. Do not panic. Do not panic. Stand by for further orders. Stand by." Half dressed, Craig lay down on his bunk and tightened the webbing around his thighs, thorax, and forehead. He wondered peevishly what had broken down and how long it would take to repair it. He was anxious to get back to Earth. The loathsome, disorienting stress of the space shift began. Then, as the Star Queen passed into real space and acquired real velocity, the apparent acceleration squeezed him against the bunk with crushing force. He struggled for breath and sanity. Then it was over, and he retched a little and fumbled at the webbing. "All passengers, all hands!" Even over the low-fidelity speaker, there was a new note in the voice, almost a tremor. "All passengers, all hands, this is the captain. This is the captain. All passengers will go at once to their own staterooms and await orders. All passengers will go at once to their own staterooms and await orders. All hands will go at once to their duty stations and await orders. All hands will go at once to their duty stations and await orders. Stand by. Stand by." Craig was swaying confusedly on his feet, still half-dressed, when the boron beryllium door to the stateroom clanged open and 5 men stepped in. One Craig recognized as an officer of the Star Queen. He was in impeccable uniform, but his hands were shackled behind his back. The other 4 men were dressed in segments of spacesuits and of the military uniforms of a dozen planets. One was a huge, grizzled old man with a deep scar across his face. 2 were sallow, younger men. One was a veiny-faced little man with a shock of white hair. In the presence of plain disaster, Craig found his wits were clear. The ship's officer stood with lowered head, not looking at Craig. Craig decided to say nothing. "Who's this?" snapped the little man. "I don't know," mumbled the officer. "He's got to be rich," said the big man. "Look at this layout." The little man glanced at Craig. "What's your name?" Craig muttered, "Smith." The trim briefcase full of his private notes on the Betelgeuse conference was lying on the work shelf, 3 feet away, in plain view. The little man wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "You rich?" asked the big man. "I was," said Craig. "That is, my wife was. But she left me. Went off with—" He lunged at the briefcase. One of the sallow men caught his shoulder, and the little man backhanded him savagely across the face. But he got to the briefcase and hammered the fat corner of it with the base of his hand. There was a sizzle and a puff of acrid, yellow smoke. The contents of the case, Craig's notes and his identification, were incinerated. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. The big man nodded. The sallow man held Craig by the upper arms. The big man punched him in the stomach. "Who are you?" yelled the little man. "John Smith," said Craig. The big man slapped him in the temple. "Watch it, Rick," said the little man. "He ain't worth anything dead." The big man said to Craig, Who are you? Are you rich? John Smith, said Craig. No! His head was ringing, but he could still think. What if these outlaws traded him to the dissident colonies? There were drugs, hypno-techniques, tortures. He had destroyed the written material on the conference, but the facts were still in his head, and the routine protective conditioning he had had was light. The little man said, "What was in there?" Craig said, exaggerating his dizziness, My girl's letters. The big man laughed coarsely. One of the sallow men snickered. The little man looked suspicious, but then jerked his head toward the door. All right, stow him away. We got to get back into infra. They shoved him out into a shuffling procession of passengers and crewmen and trundled him, still half-dressed, through the airlocks and into the Raiders' hold. Section 2 of Part 3. Piracy in space was rare when man first went out to the planets in real space ships. Ships were too hard to come by, and even after mutiny had put several spacecraft into the hands of desperate men, ports with maintenance facilities were closed to them. Then an engineer named De Silva found a way to burst into what had been Chandragopal's merely theoretical infraspace, and man went to the stars, traveling 1 light year in 3 hours and 14 minutes. The colonizing of 1,000 worlds scattered over the galaxy gave marauders and privateersmen bases enough. But interception in infraspace was a technical problem beyond the engineering ability of pirates. Pirates preyed on ships just going out or coming in, but the real space around the habitable planets was fairly easy to patrol. Then someone discovered how to intercept in infraspace, and soon pirate ships hunted, usually in pairs, between the stars. There was little that could be done. No one had found a way to propagate electromagnetic waves through infraspace. Electron and neutron streams were quickly dragged back into real space by the density of orthogonal gravitational fields. Gravitation propagated in infraspace but could not be modulated. Thus, no SOSs could be sent faster than light. A starfaring ship was on its own. It arrived at port, or it did not. The pair of raider ships that plucked the liner Star Queen out of infraspace were more businesslike and less vicious than most. One, the one that waited in a tight, processing trajectory in infraspace to block the victim's escape, was a rough but deadly combat vessel. The other, which followed the victim into real space, was a great hollowed-out tub, armed only for close fighting and with room in the hold for 1,200 slaves. Section 3 of Part 3. The hold. A ringing, howling metal cavern, sliced across by circular metal decks 7 feet apart. Over toward the perimeter of the decks, a slender helix of stars drilled down through them. At the center of the booming metal circles, a metal bowl held them up. The bowl contained the waistlines. The lights, naked floods, were mounted on it and blazed radially. They were never turned off. There were 8 shallow troughs in the deck, like the radii of a spider web, and 8 radial aisles between them, and metal benches between the aisles and over the troughs like the circling fibers of the web. The benches were just wide enough for 2 men to lie side by side on them, and running from aisle to aisle over the center of each bench, 20 centimeters above it, was a shiny metal pipe. On this slid rings, each with a 60-centimeter chain attached. At the end of each chain was the wrist manacle of a captive. The numb shuffling, the smothered sobbing of the few newly captured women, and the clangor of the decks were more terrifying than voices. Craig felt himself prodded and kneed along an aisle. The fetter was stomach-churning. Right-handed or left-handed? It was one of the sallow men, and the question was to Craig. Right, muttered Craig. The manacle ratcheted closed on his left wrist. I call this the stacks, remarked the sallow man cheerfully. I used to be a librarian. In Cincinnati, Earth. I like this better. He grinned. Your buddy will tell you the rules. He jerked his head toward a man on the other side of the pipe rail and turned away to prod another captive into place. The new captives were being mixed in among old ones. Some of the old ones eyed the newcomers, but most of them sat listlessly, and some slept. The man whose manacle ring was next to Craig's watched him over the rail. I'm Robbins, he said. He had once been paunchy, His yellowing skin hung over his jowls and bare chest. "I'm Smith," said Craig. "They feed you twice a day. That's your dish." He nodded toward a plexic bowl inverted on Craig's side of the bench. "It's also your pillow. No blankets. 4 times a day they blow whistles, and we all pull down to this end of the rail, and then we go in the trench, 2 by 2. "Go? Oh, I see," said Craig, and gagged. "Yes, it's the call. Then they hose it into the drains over there by the stem. No other times, or it just stays here," the man said. Anxiety showed in his face. "I'll be careful," said Craig. "That's about all, then." Robbins was silent for a moment, then added, with no change of voice, "I was the best sales engineer Universal Thermo ever had. Heat pumps." "We live and learn," said Craig. "The women on this tier are all over there," said Robbins. "You can get a real good view from right here when the call comes. We're lucky." "We sure are," said Craig. Section 4 of Part 3. "Robbins?" "What?" "Where's the fellow who had my place before?" "I don't know. He got sick." "Ubi sunt," said Craig, and after a time murmured, "Ubi sunt qui ante nos fuerunt. Ubi sum qui nomen iam amici." The answer to the first is quite apparent. The answer to the second, not so easy. "What?" said Robbins. "Nothing. I was doing an imitation of a man I used to know. Name of Craig. Thinking, what would he do in my place?" Section 5, Part 3. A man died the next day. The little rummy-nosed, blustering old man who had interrogated Craig aboard the Star Queen came and looked at the body. "Yep," he said. He wiped his rum blossom on his sleeve. Robbins was staring at the little mottled slaver. "I heard he used to be an obstetrician," he whispered. "Probably made more than he's making now," said Craig. "Don't you believe it," whispered Robbins. "They get a lot for us." "You, maybe," said Craig politely. "Anyway, he was probably a failure as an obstetrician. I mean, if you were a woman, would you like him poking that running nose up your works?" 2 guards kick-rolled the body to the stairs and dragged it down out of sight. "For a minute I thought they were going to shove it in the drain," said Robbins. "Oh, they have to break it up before they recycle it," Craig explained to him. Robbins studied him a moment. "That was a joke," he said. "Wasn't it?" "Then why didn't you laugh?" said Craig. Section 6, Part 3. A whistle cut into Craig's sleep. It's the call, he thought. But it can't be. It was one of the pirates, the big scarred man who had beaten Craig. He was wildly drunk. "Everybody up!" he roared. "I don't want you to miss a thing." Most of the captives sat up, blinking. A few wavered to their feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," bellowed the scarred man, "the management takes pride in presenting for the first time anywhere," he belched, "a new extravaganza entitled The Popping of Little Carrot Top, and starring that dashing debonair darling of 200 worlds, Rick Bastiano. Ta-da!" He half pranced, half reeled in a circle, grinning and shaking hands with himself above his head. "And a talented newcomer to the 3D tanks, a little girl you will all love, Miss Cherry Carrot Top." He advanced, applauding and cheering, on a young girl chained at the end of the row in the women's section. She was auburn-haired and prettyish, and could not, Craig thought, have been more than 15. She cringed away from the man. "Give the little girl a great big hand!" The man lunged down and seized her free arm, pulling her into the aisle so that she was stretched between his huge fist and her chain. He took the neck of her frock and wrenched. The light material ripped away. "Ta-da!" The girl whimpered. She had old-fashioned delicate pink underclothing, The man belched again and tore at the remaining fabric. Ta-da! Give the little girl a great big hand! For a moment there was no sound except the keening of the De Silva drive. Craig shut his eyes, but could not shut his ears. Section 7, Part 3. Breaking out of infraspace, lying on a bench with a single chain on instead of webbing, Craig's back was numb for a moment, and then the return of feeling left him with a maddening, fiery, itching bruise from shoulder blades to heels. The delusional horror in his mind cleared more slowly. Nausea came as a clue through squirming tunnels, a thread of sanity. He lay trembling. He opened his eyes. The floodlights were still off. The darkness was full of the sounds of retching, of terror, seemingly of death. The lights flared on. Craig forced himself to look around. Robbins lay still. Unconscious? Dead? There was something wrong about the set of his body. Some slavers were making their way around the benches, led by the small, white-thatched man whom Robbins had said was an ex-obstetrician. The ex-librarian from Cincinnati was among them, referring to a sheaf of papers on a clipboard. A12, female, about 40, said the ex-librarian, from the Pegasus. Left arm broken, said the little man. The ex-librarian marked his list. A13, he said, female, about 15, from the Sirius Clipper. What seems to be the trouble? The little man addressed the red-haired girl directly. His voice dropped, as if by habit, into the intonation of a doctor on ward rounds. Evidently, Robbins had been right. The girl said something in a low voice, and the little man's face darkened. Describe him. The girl spoke more softly still. Bastigliano. I knew it, said the obstetrician to the librarian. It's the second one he's spoiled on the run. It's 138 credits more out of his share. Write it down. And write down D and C on this one. B4, said the librarian. Male, about 60, from the Pegasus. Dead, said the little man. He wasn't worth keeping anyway. Robbins was E8. Dead, said the little man, annoyed. You must be running nearly 10% dead this time. What do you have? He asked the librarian. 8%, anyway, maybe 10. Craig could now see what had happened. Robin's dish had slid out from under his head as they came into real space, and he had broken his neck. You lost a good one there, Doctor, he said loudly to the little man. He was the best sales engineer Universal Thermo ever had. I'd complain if I were you. Shut up, Weisenheimer, said the little man. The librarian backhanded Craig across the side of the head. Shut up, Weisenheimer, he said. 3 or 4 hours later, a shuddering howl filled the hold, and the slave ship touched down somewhere. Section 8, Part 3. They died as embryos would die. E8, B4, they were asleep. In space. Without a chance to cry, they failed. And who will weep? The sparks fly upward, and the dark devours them as the whale devours the frisking minnows. Not a mark to show where passed the hours. I'm not sincere enough, said Craig to Robin's empty place. Section 9, Part 3. He came lightly down the helical stairs, this delicate apparition with the Rugo's powdery face, holding a folded handkerchief. Scented, no doubt, said Craig, aloud to no one in particular, Robin's being dead. Before his nostrils and pointing the toe as he descended, just as the whistle blew for the call, and he put on a pair of heavy, antique spectacles to examine the proceedings. Craig, squatting over the trench, watched him approach, and the old queen somehow picked up that watchfulness and came closer, manipulating the spectacles with his tinted left claw as if they were a quizzing glass. Craig bent to his task, and when the visitor was standing almost over him, said in a hoarse, conspiratorial whisper, without looking up and through unmoving lips, Sir, there's a rumor here that B4 is a hermaphrodite. Is that true? Oh, said the visitor in a low, reedy voice, and, after a quick, intent inspection of Craig, moved casually away toward 2 crewmen. They were the librarian and the burly rapist Bastigliano, nearby. A moment's talk passed between the 3. The crewmen looked puzzled, and the librarian consulted his clipboard. Then the three shrugged, one after the other, and the visitor moved on. Craig could not make out any of their conversation, but did catch what appeared to be a proper noun. Kosar. It was the first time he had heard this name. Alright, well that's going to be done for our reading for now. That was sections 1 through 9 of part 3 of Donald Barr's Space Relations. So far, this is a pretty detailed. And so far it does seem pretty sympathetic to the slaves that are in this situation. Now, I don't know how the story is going to progress, and from what I remember, John Craig does become content with the slave-master-slave relationship as he remains a slave, but that's much, much later in the story, and I don't want to basically put that thought in your head for now. That's just what I remember. But so far, I don't hear anything incriminating of Donald Barr. I mean, this seems pretty darn sympathetic to the plight of slaves. But, I guess we'll just have to see, because from what I remember, John Craig, he changes to be one to enjoy the slave-master-slave system. But I guess we'll have to find out, right? But anyway, that'll be it for today. I expect to do 2 more parts next week. Take care. Have a nice day. This is Ranting Politics.